Allora, è molto avventuroso anche il seminario di oggi. Due parole per riprendere la prima parte del seminario, a cui però naturalmente molti di voi, ma non tutti, erano presenti. Nella prima parte del seminario la professoressa Finnegan ha messo in prospettiva e ha, diciamo così, messo anche in questione l'opposizione secca tra scrittura, modi scritti e oralità, e diciamo l'utilità del cosiddetto Great Divide, cioè della grande opposizione su cui, diciamo, si sono espressi in particolare Walter Long e Goody, naturalmente, ma in parte anche Lord, e quindi questo modo di opporre queste due modalità come se fossero due poli, mettendo in rilievo appunto che in realtà queste modalità interagiscono continuamente, anche in un continuum storico, a partire insomma, da una serie di casi specifici come quello della lettura ad alta voce, praticata sostanzialmente fino al Medioevo, e mettendo anche in evidenza l'aspetto, diciamo così, epistemologico, direi quasi, in senso più ampio, cioè quanto ha influenzato una visione gerarchica della scrittura alfabetica in particolare come vertice di della cultura umana e quindi implicitamente tutte le forme che non sono scrittura alfabetica, comprese le forme di scrittura, ad esempio africana, sono forme in qualche modo implicitamente inferiori e quindi in qualche modo si escludono vicendevolmente. È arrivata poi a parlare di scrittura per dire che anche la scrittura, come l'oralità, vive in una multimodalità. Yeah, more or less, I think I've summarized few of the points you touched last time. So, if you like, you can start again.
Right. Well, when we talk about the voice and the pen, it's only right to start as I did with the voice, hearing, audition. I won't go through all that again, just to say it is such a shame that scholars have, for so very long, and even now still, ignored orality, the voice, or thought that orality was something very different from writing. In fact, as we now know, I think we would all agree, and I learned a lot about this in Urbino in Italy, the voice and the pen, orality and writing, interlink, they overlap, they work together, they are often parallel and talking to each other ways of communicating. They're very rich, there are so many ways the voice can be used. Audition is, after all, the first and the last sense, not just for humans either, but always used in a multimodal way. It's interesting, this word sensational, with its kind of double and very appropriate meanings. So we're very aware now of the continuity and overlap. But let me now think of writing, a very important modality, sense of human beings. And when I say the pen, I could equally have said the brush, the chisel, the fingers, the mind, the hands moving across a surface which might be imaginary perhaps, or these instruments, these tools, inscribing into the surface or raising it up in a kind of relief to communicate in ways that have become conventional. So there are many kinds of writing, many forms of it. But let's begin with the one that's most familiar to us, that is alphabetical writing, the consonantal writing system of words. Now, it seems to have begun with Semitic languages are still there, very important. Right back, can you believe it, in the second millennium BC. There have been many other invented systems recently, many in Africa actually, often coming through dreams. But nearly all alphabetic scripts today go back to the Semitic proto-alphabet, as it gets called. Now, it started, and I think this is very moving and worth knowing, in ancient Egypt. Now, in ancient Egypt, they had a hieroglyphic system, pictograms, really complex because each concept, each concept was represented by a different hieroglyph. Well, now, this is what I think is so moving. At the time when the Hebrew slaves were working in Egypt, they wanted to communicate, but they didn't have the advantage of any schooling, unlike their masters. And even for the Egyptians themselves, not all could have learned that complex system, as complex as Chinese is nowadays. But nevertheless, the slaves wanted to communicate. So what they did was so clever. They took just some key concepts that they wanted, like bread, and they took the hieroglyph for that, and they turned it into what matched a word, the sound, not the picture, not the abstract concept. And that was the beginning of our alphabetic system. I think it's so wonderful. Think of the horrific thing of slavery in the early 20th century. That gave rise to the Negro spirituals, a beautiful flower coming out of horrific, wicked and cruel ground. Now, the point about this was that it represented sounds, this writing did, unlike the Egyptians, which represented ideas. And that is the ancestor of the Semitic language systems. Okay, and then through Phoenician, it came to get the vowels as well, probably through the Middle East, Europe now, North Africa, South Asia. We actually find writing without vowels perfectly easy now. Think of text messages on mobiles. It actually works quite well. So I no longer think the Hebrew system of no vowels is really difficult. But anyway, the vowels probably came about the 8th century BC. The Greeks, of course, adapting from the Phoenician alphabet. They're all based on sound, the alphabetic, vowel, consonantal systems. So we often talk about this system of writing as phonographic sounds, or based on words, logographic or logocentric. Now, that is the one we know best. But before that and alongside it, and this is such an important point, and this in a way is the whole key point of what I want to say, and the surprising conclusion I'm going to end you up with. Before that, there were the pictographic systems, like the Egyptian hieroglyphs, where you had a conventionalized abstract kind of picture representing the actual thing, the concept, like in Chinese, or in the New World, the Maya and the Aztec. You can see some pictures in that, by the way, in the handout. And since we're now talking very much about a visual medium, I think the handout will be useful. I won't keep referring to it. I think you have the sense to look at it, if you've got it. Working through pictures rather than sound is really wonderful for trans-language communication. Think of Chinese. In China, there are many different languages. They're not mutually comprehensible. But for those who can write, which of course is only some, it is completely intelligible mutually because they use the same pictures, whatever the sound. It doesn't matter what the sound is. So there's one writing system understood by all, and this is a very important point. There's a very good book, which I think is one of the most mind-opening one that I think you might be interested in look at, and it's in the list of references there, called Writing Without Words, mainly about the Maya and Aztec and Andean system, but it applies to all pictographic systems where the writing gives you the thing itself rather than the sound, sometimes called sumersiographic writing. And that is the oldest, one might say, the most natural way of using the pen or the brush or the quill or transcribing tool on the surface or whatever. And the surface, of course, I should have said, could be paper, papyrus, leather, codex, concrete, clay, sand, stone, imaginary surface in the air, a ceiling, a wall, you name it. And it's not outdated. Sometimes when people overdo this evolutionary thing, they think, oh, that was a way back or far off. You know, we are the West, we're not the rest. But think of shop signs. We have some wonderful ones from Pompeii, for example. Conventional pictures or images, or coats of arms, or laurels, where I've won various prizes, and they don't give me any money, but they often give me a picture, an image that I can use, where it's not where it says Literary Titan Silver Award or Gold Award or something. It's the decoration around the edge that makes me feel good. Or think now there is so much international travel among mutually unintelligible languages. What kind of signs do we have in airports? Do they use words, or are they rather recognizable icons which everyone has learned to understand? And nowadays, we really go in for logos as if they're something recent. Well, actually, they're not that recent. I mean, you get them in coats of arms and so on. But they are now something that you pay thousands, tens of thousands of pounds to get created for you. I remember when my university changed the logo, it cost thousands of pounds. We didn't all agree, though the end logo was very nice. Sometimes you get, as you can see, words text next to the picture. So you have both the written logocentric and the iconographic pictorial view. Sometimes it's just the picture. And in a way, this is almost a kind of transitional stage or a combination of the pen and the picture, or the pen as logocentric written and the picture as pictorial. And it can be very communicative if you look just at the picture side of it. Think of book covers. You have the text, you have the name there, and that's important. And I suppose the author, well, if it's me or you, but the cover itself, the picture there, conveys so much about the book, whether it's a kind of textbook, rather stern looking, something about some abstract academic thing, a reference book, a book of fiction, a book of cheap fiction, and often a picture can tell a story in a way that words really can't quite, not just in the thing so well said that a picture is worth 1,000 words or is 1,000,000 words, but that if you look at the picture of a woman sitting in a sedan chair, and then the upright people carrying it, and how the uniform they're wearing, the way she's looking out, that tells a picture in a way that really words can't. These aren't the only ways in which pictorial visual science can convey. Think of maps, way back conveying information. Or think of the amazing pictures in the past on medieval church walls, people would know the stories from the Bible, which they couldn't read. Or think of that wonderful Annunciation picture in Assisi. I think I remember being so moved by that. The story is all there. You don't want to read the words. Or look at the Assyrian lion hunt. So full of the strength of the lions, the courage of the men, the blood, the sacrifice, the ceremony, the glory, or similar things in the Bayeux tapestry of the way in which England was conquered way back then. So again, I would see another kind of continuum, that there's no real break between writing and pictorial representation. Once you get away from the idea that the only way of proper writing and the pinnacle of civilization is the alphabetic, the pictorial, shading it from pictographic writing like signs, but not of words, into what we would call complete pictures. Now, I would say that the voice and the pen are not the only communication modes, or only if you take pen in the very broad sense, which includes material artifacts like sculptures or reliefs or sand pictures that the Australian Aborigines had really impressive conventional symbols for, or the Mesoamerican quipu, which was a series of strings really put together by which they recorded history, not in words, not in pictures even, but in this rather surprising artifact. And then, of course, there are the drum and whistle languages. I don't want to go into them now, but they are very effective in jungle circumstances where you cannot see people, and the voice doesn't really reach, but conventional signals on the drum will. It's also used in Swiss valleys, across the valleys where you can't really see, you can't shout, but if you whistle, you can communicate, and there are conventional ways of doing that. But I want to focus more on the visual, generally, artifacts, attire, sculptures, buildings, gesturing. Yes, gesture. I want to now focus a little bit on gesture because it's extremely important to my overall argument. Now, there's been much more interest in that recently. People used to think language was just words, sounds, and writing. But now kinesics and proxemics are whole spheres of scholarship and very good study, Adam Kendon and so on. And in a way, kinesics is, that is the visual gestures, face, body language, and so on. It's below the level of consciousness, subliminal, but extremely important in communication. In fact, some new looks at language will now say that gesture is part of language. I remember when I started or tried to get on with French, spoken French, the only thing that really helped me was the book that began, you must first learn French gestures. Lay aside words and so on. Gestures, for example, when you eat, you must keep your hands on the table, whereas in my own culture, that's really rude, keep them down below. And that was really helpful. Also, the way they said you can express anything in French by la la la, depending on how you say it and the gestures you use with it. La la la, la la la, la 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 la. Well, you know, we probably have something similar in Italian. And then, of course, it's even more systematized in conventional systematic sign languages, like languages for the deaf, some of which are international, some of which are specific to particular languages. And then the whole way in which you can make gestures as if there's a kind of a surface or a line between me and you, And you can just represent them on a bit of paper, like some of the very good discussions of Italian gestures or Australian Aborigine gestures, or you can actually make them. You know what some of them, you know what quote marks or, yes? Of course, everyone knows how good the Italians are at this. I'm afraid there are a lot of jokes about this, which by now you're not finding funny. Like on a cold day, this poor Italian couldn't talk because he had to keep his hands in his pocket, which I think is really quite funny. But it is quite a serious thing. I've noticed with Chinese people that if they want to communicate something that's been a bit difficult or try to work out something for themselves, what they do is they use their hands to write on a bit of paper, not actually writing, it's just seeing what it might be, or on their hand or something. And in that way, to them, what comes clear is not the spoken language, it is the concept as pictorialized. So again, pictures, concepts, writing are so close. And I would say gestures indeed do share many features of writing, treated as if working on a surface, symbolic, like music, probably a human, I'm sure, a human universal, an animal too. So more or less systematized or elaborated, sometimes with particular professions or groups and specialisms. They're very, very useful gestures in places where people cannot be heard or where they need to stand out among the crowd. Football referees have established forms of gestures, or crane drivers, where the crane driver is way up above and they want to tell people down below how to lower, or how they want the crane driver to lower or something. It's a matter of life or death. Or people up a tree, or trying to decide where a tree would fall when they cut it down. Or among thieves, where other people won't understand their secret societies, their secret gestures. So in general, this is another way of communicating, expressing, celebrating, not on an actual page, but as if on a surface, as I say, or a wall between us. You can reach out through gestures. And it probably was one of the earliest forms of human and animal communication. Darwin, in fact, I hadn't realized till fairly recently, wrote about the importance of gestures among animals. And he has some wonderful pictures of dogs, how their body language, gesture is not just really of hands, body language, either aggressive or making friends. If you know dogs, you will, I don't need to explain what that's like. So I would say here is another continuum. I'm a great continuum person. Not just between sound and writing, orality and literacy, but also between gesture, writing, pictures. Very visual. So what? This is where I come to something that may surprise you. So hold your horses and just listen. You may not agree, but I do think that this is something worth considering. Now, the usual story about the development of human communication that we know from Hong, Jack Goody, Albert Lord, and great writers they were. We learned so much, especially when I disagree, I think, with some things. I think they were revolutionary. Now, let's say Walter Ong. He wrote Orality and Literacy, remember? Now, I wrote, in a way, a kind of a counter book, Literacy and Orality, not because I thought literacy came first, but just I wanted to be a little bit different. But this, in a way, is the foundational myth myth, not just of Western civilization, but really of world history as we see it. First of all, you had the voice, orality. Then you had writing, which worked up to alphabetic Roman script writing and print, and which the Western expansion people went out to teach the natives, okay, along with some other rather strange things, but some good things too. And then, of course, now we have the digital, which doesn't always work, as we know. But if you take the wider view of writing, which I've mentioned, the pictographic, shading into pictures, reliefs, shading into gestures as well, then we can see various different modes, the oral, spoken, the penned word, penned images, pictures. Every kind of picture, working back to prehistory, like that very anatomically correct picture of a bison. So we end up with a wider trans-historical, trans-cultural concept of writing, of communication more broadly, leading me to the shocking surmise that if we take this broad view of writing as allied to pictures and gestures, writing came before orality. We had the pen before the voice. Or that's putting it at an extreme. Maybe I had better say that writing, gesture, writing in the sense of visual communication through pictures, pictographic and so on the surface, writing was developed alongside, but no later than spoken communication and gestures communication. These came together at the start. And after all, human beings are a bit distinct from animals in being basically audio-visual creatures. So surely it is not surprising to think that from the very beginning, both audition and the visual went alongside. And the visual, well, I said earlier that audition was rather downgraded in scholarship. In a way, I think the visual is too, the visual in its wider sense. So, right, blasphemy, I don't think that writing came later than orality, or that orality came before writing, in my view of the nature, the development of human communication, expression, celebration, art. So I think this is a view which I've now come to after many, many years, and I'm quite old by now, but I think it is one worth considering. So thank you very much, dear friends, dear students, dear colleagues, for listening. May you all fare well in our use and study and value of the voice and in its broader sense of the pen. Arrivederci, my friends.
Thank you very much, Ruth. Thank you very, very much. This was a very thought-provoking and I would say mind-opening talk. So really, thank you so much. Now we can open the debate, and anybody is invited to intervene with a question or a comment, both in English and Italian. You can translate it easily.
Sorry, I gave you my only one word of Italian.
Okay. Now
I know another beautiful phrase that an old man sitting next to me in a bus once said to me. He was very old. He said, "Arrivederci in paradiso," and that was lovely. I have to be careful when I say it, though.
Okay. Now we have Sorry, I've lost who raised the hand, but whoever was, please go on.
Hello, my name is Kezala Jere.
Hiya.
I'm a student at LabOrality University from Zambia, and I'm doing studies in Great Zimbabwe. So it's very, first of all, thank you for the wonderful, thought-provoking lecture as mentioned by Professor Manuela. So now my curiosity is there's a book I've come across. It's a book written by Professor Hoofman from South Africa. So in this book, he talks about his ethnographic sources, mainly from the Portuguese sources and the Shona, and the Shona, who are the local people. So in this book, he talks about basically, for me, I think the link between the story and the physical place. So he talks about a man who's never been to the Great Zimbabwe Wars, but has been hearing about the stories about Great Zimbabwe. So the time the man goes to see the ruins of Great Zimbabwe, he's able to connect from the stories he's heard from his grandparents and the previous people, and then he tries to connect and is able to identify the places based on the story. So how can I say, mine is not a question per se, but it's more like find a way of trying to find out how we can link the story and the place. And I think this is one thing somehow I feel in Africa we are hindered by superstition. For example, it's very hard to go to ritual places, and you don't want to relate the story to the place. I don't know what comment you'd have on that one in linking the story and the place.
That is such a good comment. And hello, I have been to Great Zimbabwe, the Zimbabwe ruins, which are so impressive. And I wish, you're right, the visual is so important, the place. I wish I could show you a picture of it, but maybe, my friend, you could send round a picture sometime to the whole group so they could see it.
Sure.
I come from Ireland. Yeah, please do. I come from Ireland originally, and that is so important for my storytelling. I've also learned a lot from Africa, and that's very important for my storytelling. And I used to hear stories from my mother, and I always imagined the setting in which they were for Ireland, and also the musical setting. The very, very first music I ever heard, her singing the Garton Mother's Lullaby, sleep my babe, and so on. I wasn't trying to sing. No, don't laugh at me. I can see you smiling. But it was from a beautiful hidden place in County Donegal in West Ireland, that called Garton, the Garton Mother's Lullaby. And all that, I hope you don't mind me just giving a personal example. Oh, I remember the Shona people, of course, in Zimbabwe. It was then Southern Rhodesia. It's recently come home to me more in a very direct way. I've now started, and it's very much inspired by African storytelling, to write screenplays, to be made into a film, though I haven't yet got the millions of pounds I need to make the film. So if any of you are millionaires out there, I will go away immediately. And I've written one, well, it all came in dreams, in that liminal state, that is, rather, between sleeping and waking, when you're not either, but you're both. A story about a girl, and it all is set in Ireland. And it couldn't have happened if it hadn't been set in Ireland, though at one point, the turning point in the story, you reminded me this, is a story by a street sleeper who is actually from Africa. And you see a little bit of an African storytelling and all the kinesics and the dancing and the music in it. And I've tried to get some producers interested, and the most recent comment, a very positive comment about it, was, you should do a lookbook, Ruth. What? A lookbook? That is a book, a file with images to show people what Ireland looks like. Because unless they know about that locality and that setting, they won't understand the story. And you know, I hadn't thought of it quite like you said, but you are so absolutely right. Do you write stories yourself, and do they have a Zimbabwean setting?
Sorry, I have an architectural background, so what I'm trying to do now is just to do some studies, spatial analysis study. So one of my sources, or one of the books I've been reading, is how this professor did those studies using ethnographic sources like storytelling, yeah, and is able to understand the pattern of the settlement through the stories.
That is so good. So keep it. I mean, another way of putting it, which sounds more academic, is that a story needs to be in its culturally specific setting for both the content of the story and for the audience to understand what's going on. Thank you very much. What a good point. I've learned a lot.
Okay. Thank you very much. Ruth, just a small thing. Could you try and turn the computer with video camera towards you, because we can't see you, and but I think the camera is towards.
Oh yes. Oh yes.
You know, so if you can turn it around. Okay, just see if this works. I don't know. Okay. We have.
I can see you. So.
Okay, that's fine. So we have Andrea Ercolani and then Livio Spardella. Andrea?
Here we are. Many thanks for Professor Finnegan. I would like to start with... so many thanks, Ruth. I thank you very much for your double seminar. And I would like to start with a very provocative question. Which is the most economic way of communication, in your opinion? Writing or the so-called spoken word? And for economic, I mean everything. From economy in its basic and fundamental meaning, and in a capacity of transmitting a message. So this is my first question. The second one, you mentioned before a kind of joint ventures, in a manner of speaking, between writing and visual tools of communication. I would like to draw your attention on stamps, which, if I am correct, you did not mention, because stamps, which have been a very important communication method in the last century, so have been studied, for instance, from Jack Child, precisely from this point of view, as a semiotic tool, and a very useful one, which combines exactly writing and visual images. One last remark, which is not a remark, but just one more point of admiration. You mentioned languages which are not spoken and which are not written, that is, sign or hand languages. This is a very central point, in my opinion, because as philologists, we are used to think language is something which is spoken on one side or written as a consequence on the other side. But that's not true. There's a third way in a manner of speaking. That is sign languages, which is neither nor, but which is both of them together. Many thanks.
Thanks, very good point. I agree about stamps, and I would say the coins do something of the same thing, and again have been very, very widely studied and have been around for a long, long time. And stamps and seals, you know, the ceramic, the oil seals that you put on are a little bit the same. So that's a very good point. Now the first, oh yes, economic. I would say it depends on the circumstances. Well, until we had digital communication sometimes working, as we saw, for a face-to-face, certainly speech, I would say, is much more effective than writing. Though writing can be used to conceal things, even face-to-face. Writing can also be used to conceal things. You know, I'm sure you know the derivation of the word sincere, sine cera, without the wax that kept the written communication concealed from when the messenger took it. But for far off communication, until quite recently, really the only way was writing, and in the broader sense, pictures. So really spoken communication wasn't much use for that. There is also, I've just got into this, but again, it's very controversial, communication through the ether, from extrasensory communication, which really, I think, does work, though it is very, very hard to pin it down. So I do think that there is not any one most economic form of communicating or expression. It does depend on, as so often, on the circumstances. Have I answered the right question? Is that okay?
Many thanks. Yes, you did. Many thanks.
Good.
Now, Livio Sbardella.
Hi, Ruth.
Hello.
Many thanks also by me for your very, very interesting communication.
Thank
I want to introduce another point. Don't you think that we must introduce another term in this description of the evolution of logocentric mentality? I mean the printing. Because the printing is a very important degree in this evolution. Because of the static dimension of the text introduced by the printing and not by the chirographic culture. There is a big difference in the evolution of the logocentric mentality introduced by the static conception of the text included in the printing, in the culture of printing. And so I think that there could be another step in your argumentation. And that step must be the printing, the culture of printing. What about?
I must think about that. I think we all think about that. Again, being me, I see the continuities. It is so interesting the way the first printed books were based on script forms. And now we sometimes go back to those, now that we have the opportunity of doing more visual, easy things on the web, we're going back to using some of those wonderful script forms. So I would totally agree with you that this is another great stage. So, you know, well, maybe not staged, but though we do know the history of it beginning, though actually print began in China and then moved across, as paper moved across to the West. There's a wonderful book about that. I'm also very fascinated by the continuities. So I don't know that there's a great mental shift, but in some ways it is, because as you say, it fixes things on the page so that even the story isn't dynamic in quite the same way, though print, of course, can be read aloud, so that becomes dynamic. But I was very aware of this when I was studying storytelling in West Africa, because I would record things and then I would transcribe them, and then they were ultimately published on a printed, static, unmoving page. And just everything about the story seemed to be lost because print was so different. Even writing somehow seemed a little bit more flexible. Print was so different from the dynamic, multimodal way. But then again, if you look at print, it is different. It does have mental consequences. It has limitations and it has advantages. This is what brings me back to my view that print too is multimodal. You've got to take it alongside, back to the first speaker's comment, alongside its situation and the other pictures or formals or paper and so on that goes with it. So a very good point, but there's a lot we need to go on to think about from there. We're at the beginning, not the end. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ruth.
Okay, I have a few comments, but in the meanwhile, whoever wants to ask a question or express a comment may raise the hand or write on the chat. Anche chiunque voglia intervenire, anche studentesse, studenti, anche in italiano, poi possiamo tradurre facilmente, insomma, in inglese, quindi non facciamoci limitare dalla lingua. With a couple of points. One, I think I was thinking that Jack Goody spoke of the Great Divide. So, like writing being introduced and changing everything. And I think you have already demonstrated in your book about literacy and orality that this great divide doesn't work, but there's not really a divide. And I think that the ancient Greece, interestingly, is a very good counter-argument, because we know that in Greece, the alphabet was introduced in the 8th century, but it didn't change much until at least the end of the 5th century. But in a fundamental way, I think later on. So we had centuries where the writing was introduced, was known, but it did not actually change communication and media dramatically, as Goody or Walter Wrong, for that matter, argued. So I thought that your talk was about the great continuum rather than the great divide, and I think it's great, and you have very good points in nuancing what we see as actually a breach between one face and another. On this, I was thinking two main elements. One comes from a neuroscientist, Stanislas Dehaene, who works in Paris, and in a talk in Siena in September 19, he was trying to pin down what, from the point of view of neurophysiology, what makes our communication exclusively human. In other words, what it is that we don't share, for example, with primates. And his point was that this exclusive way of human beings of communicating, which we don't share in his mind with other mammals, with other primates, would be the ability of combining images and combining figures of different sets of figures. So, and I think I mentioned this to you already, but I think that would go in your direction very much. And so taking a different approach, apparently one would get to the same conclusion. The other thing is this great book by Leroy-Gourhan. I don't know how to translate it into English, something like The Gesture and the Word, where from the point of view of evolution, he explains the fact of having been able to speak by the fact that at a certain moment with our erected position, our stand-up position, our hands were free, and our hands freed our mouth to speak. So, in other words, this combination of gesture and word, from the point of view of physical anthropology, it goes again in the same direction, as well as the fact that in our prefrontal cortex, the same area of language is the area of language is the same area that we use for our hands, for gesturing, and there are a number of studies on that, like for example when children start to refine their languages, they also refine the motions of the fingers, which is very interesting. And for example, elderly people, when they lose the fine movements of the fingers, they also lose something in their syntax, in their ability. So it's very interesting that this continuum that we were pointing out has actually very interesting, I think, parallels from different points of view. I mean, by different approaches and different different maps, I would say. The last point about what Livio was saying before, I think that it is true that you may have multimodality in printing too, but it is also true, and that's of course the point of Marshall McLuhan, that once you have printed books, you have something that was not available before, that is uniformity. So every single book is like the others, which is something which is impossible in manuscripts, for example. So in a way, I think that on this point, McLuhan is right in saying that actually this changes something quite substantial in our way of communicating, because then you have something that you don't have with any individual artifacts or whatever. So,
yeah, that is so beautiful, and in a way. Well, not in a way. I mean, truly, I think human physiology is very important. Our upright posture, bipedal, frees the hands, as you say. So maybe I should have made my talk called The Voice, the Pen, and the Hands, because that is they're related together, but we need all multimodal again, all three of them. And going back to the Great Divide, I know I've spent a lot of my time disagreeing with Jack Goody, as well as the others, but I owe him such a debt. He was a lovely person. I really enjoyed meeting him and his wife. He was always very kind to me, very helpful in my career and personally. But I think we owe him a great debt for this Great Divide business. I don't know where that term first came from, because he wrote about literacy. And up till then, we anthropologists had never thought that literacy was something to study. It was just there, and it was nothing to do with the people's so-called primitive that we studied. In fact, I remember when I was doing field work in West Africa among a people called the Limba, there were some people from other tribes, as they then were called, scattered living among them. And I was told about a very learned man who lived in a hut several villages away, and didn't I want to visit him? And I said, no, I'm studying you people. And that was so foolish of me, because obviously he was there, he was influencing them, they were influencing him. But because he was literate, I thought it was nothing to do with me. Wasn't that awful of me? So Goody made literacy something to study. And then at the same time, he made orality something to study. We'd all just taken for granted that was the natural way of life. Nothing to study there. And that is the first thing anthropologists must query, the things we take for granted. So we all owe Goody and people writing in similar ways, Marshall McLuhan, who I think was a bit misguided, and Ong and Lord, we owe them such a debt for the places in a way that we now would say were wrong, but that they made us look at and question for the first time.
Thank you very much. Maurizio Bettini. Maurizio.
Yeah, thank you. Can you hear me? Yeah?
Yep.
Yeah, good. So thank you, Professor Fini, for this extraordinary exposition. I'm so happy that we finally succeeded in having you in our seminar. It's like the labors of Hercules, I think, that finally we went through all that. But so I absolutely agree with you about the sort of unexistence of the great divide between orality and written culture. And for example, Roman culture seems to be one of the most written culture in the world. For centuries went on using the spoken word for many cultural practices. Like, for example, the juridical practice, the law, was more spoken than written. And also in the literature, for example, we record Virgil as one of the most written poets in our history. But if you consider the contemporaries of Virgil, his contemporary Julius Montanus used to say, if I could to steal something to Virgil, I would steal the voice of Virgil. Not similes, not the verses, not the metrics, but the voice, because it was recited, not read. Okay, so I absolutely agree with you. There is another aspect of your exposition I would like to comment very briefly, and the idea that, in a sense, gestures and voice and the pen meant as a tool to draw images or to draw pictures and so forth, accompanied human communication since the beginning. This is true. So the pen came before. But on the other hand, the alphabet, the characters of the alphabet, especially a phonetic alphabet, but also in a sense a logographic alphabet, have the power to reproduce the fundamental feature of a human language, that is syntax. So they can reproduce the syntactical order. I know that I'm reviving here an old Chomskyan debate between semanticism and syntacticism, but it's true that gesture, images, and sounds and so forth have a powerful semantic potentiality, but they are very poor in syntactic order. Whereas the alphabet can reproduce what is fundamentally language, that is the capability of making a structure out of thinking, of building up a sort of, of progression in thinking and articulation in thinking. So in that sense, I would say that the alphabet is a real revolution. In that sense, in a syntactic sense.
I agree. That is so well put. I mean, I know I spent a lot of my recent thinking, like in my communicating book, saying we so put language on the top of the hierarchy because there are so many other modes that are so important. But actually, I do think, well, I brought up in the classical tradition, I do think language is so wonderful. Grammar is so wonderful. And the different ways that languages treat, for example, the future tense. Some languages don't have a future tense. Is that not wonderful? And the words that, I don't know where they come from, but their etymology. Think of the word consciousness. That's our big topic now, terribly fashionable. Consciousness. What is that word? It is thinking together, knowing together. Con, and then from skio. That is so beautiful, so deep. Language is truly wonderful, whether printed, whether written, whether spoken, and our kind of making language something we can study, which at one point it really wasn't, particularly in this prose form when poetry was the obvious thing and prose was the special thing written down. We learn so much from that by taking it seriously. Thank you for reminding me of that, sir.
Andrea Ercolani ancora, Andrea.
Sorry to monopolize discussion. Anyway, we know of some inscriptions which were set very apart from human beings, so to say. That is, nobody was really able to read them because they were very, very high in the mountains or in very difficult places where nobody was able to go at easy. And we have a few instances of inscriptions which were set, for instance, inside tombs or the like. These examples, in order to question, do you know of any instance of writing which is used with no communicative purpose? Because that would be, in my opinion, a very interesting point. I mean, writing which is used just gratiartis, arts gratiartis, which no intent of communication behind writing itself. First question. Second one, I start again describing an example. In Mesopotamian embassies, normally we had a messenger who delivered a letter, a written one, but what was important was not the written text, but the words who spoke in front of the referee, of the king whom the letter was delivered to. How would you explain this different value which was set on the written form and on the spoken word? Thanks again.
Good. I don't know. I'm not sure. I think maybe it depends again on the setting. I mean, sometimes what is really important is the symbolic power of the spoken word, but sometimes it is the symbolic power of the written word, and it does depend on the cultural specificities attached to not particular media really, but particular situations. But I think we'll have to go on thinking about that. But as for the kind of function of, say, inscriptions and writing, or first, I think inscriptions, you're right, are sometimes in very hidden places. There's been a fairly recent study of inscriptions in North Africa, which only fairly recently have been, well, they've been known, but have been the subject of scholarly study. And they go back millennia, but the fact that they hadn't been studied helped to encourage this quite mistaken myth that Africa was the land without writing. In fact, writing has been important, Arabic writing largely, but somehow that didn't seem to count for Western scholars. Been important in Africa for millennia, I think of Ethiopia, and for centuries. But as for understanding the purpose, it's really difficult. I mean, you probably know that Linear B got deciphered. It was former Greek, I think, or pre-Greek. At the time when I was, way back in the 50s, when I was a student, the person doing it would come each week in the lecture and say, and this week we've discovered the meaning of this. We still don't know the meaning of Linear A. But I think when it is discovered, it will be discovered that it was not used for information in the narrow sense. It was used for display, a symbol, a bit like a statue, that it wasn't the cognitive meaning at all that mattered. And what you've just said reminded me of that. And I will be looking out for maybe you or someone to be telling us. It might well have been Greek, but it would have been Greek for display and beauty and art, not for information, far less for accounting purposes. I don't know that that answers your comment, but it certainly made us all, made me think further. Thank you so much.
I thank you very much. Your idea of display is very useful, and I think I will think of a lot. Thank you very much again.
Well, keep in touch. Tell me what you find.
Riccardo Palmisciano.
First of all, thank you very much, Ruth, for your not provocative, but very, very important lecture. After having heard you, I must think about the relationship between literacy and orality in different terms. You have modified my point of view.
Thank you.
But in this travel back to the origin of language, you have stressed the importance of visuality, and you have switched the writing system from the phonic and phonic to the visual dimension. I consider this very, very convincing because this agrees with what we know about the first man, the first history, the prehistory of mankind, when man needed to have the skill to see the nature in which they lived, and they must be able to know the problems they can have. They must see the animals and also the enemies. So in war or during the hunt, the visual dimension was much more important than other linguistic skills. And so it's not by chance that in our brain, the place where linguistic skills and gesture skills are so strongly linked. So what you have said obliges me to understand more deeply the relationship between visual and linguistic skills from a new point of view, that is to understand the first development of human mind. And orality is a good example of this connection between visual and phonic or sounding systems, because during a dialogue, the two speakers in a dialogue are two living images. First of all, they are moving images of people who are speaking. So we cannot divide the visual and the phonic dimension during a dialogue. And I agree with you that gesture is so important, because in oral communication, we cannot separate words from gestures. And so this is the right direction, and we must keep on. And thank you so much again.
That is, yes. There's so much to think about when this finally gets written up, because I think it will be. There are so many points now that I can bring into mind from this discussion. Communication really is multi-sided, isn't it? It's also very interesting that questions about the origin of language have come into play again, almost into fashion. I think it was about 100 years ago that there was a meeting of, I think it was called the International Philological Society, probably in Paris, where they decided they were no longer going to print in their learned journal anything about the origins of language, because there had been such nonsense, speculative written about it. And so for many, many years, people didn't dare or didn't think to ask about the origin of language. But now I think we've come back to it in a much more sensible and measured way, realizing that it's got to be a bit speculative for the moment. Maybe later there will be more evidence. I think that it goes along very much with the recently reviving interest in the origins of music. Because after all, music and language, again, they shade into each other. And that's a relatively recent concept that's been much more accepted now. It's such a wonderful, wonderful subject to study that we're all involved in, isn't it?
Okay. Thank you very much. So, you have time if there's another comment or question. Se qualcuno vuole approfittare per un'ultima domanda o commento.
Manu, una cosa soltanto.
Livio.
I want to remember that the most ancient reference to writing in Greek culture is a pass in the Iliad during the tale of Glaucus on his ancestor Bellerophon, and the writing is defined semata. The real meaning of the passage is very discussed by philologists, but it is very relevant that the most ancient reference to writing in Greek culture is not grammata, but semata, and something between orality, pictography, and writing, a very ambiguous dimension of the writing.
And it comes in an oral poem. Well, I mean, now we think of it as an oral poem. You're quite right. I was going to say it was Plato in Phaedrus, but it comes in Homer. Marks. Yes, not letters. Marks. That is so right. So good. Thank you. We must be coming near the end now. Not that I want to shut anybody off.
No. I just wanted to add to what Leo said. I really agree with what he said, and it just reminded me, I was studying book 23 of the Iliad, and so the funeral games for Patroclus, and when they finished to build the tomb of Patroclus, it's called Sema. I think it's quite interesting, and it really, I mean, it acquires a new meaning now. Thinking back to these words and to the type of communication it's using. So the visual communication of what a tomb is, and especially in a ritual context, like that particular context is. Okay.
A tomb is the link between the living and the dead, isn't it? Just like writing, and now in a way orality leads us down through the generations. We are so fortunate.
Okay. So I think that we are going to a close. Well, thank you so much. Thank you so much to Ruth Finnegan. And I said the other time that Professor Finnegan took us on a journey to Africa back in the 70s, and really brought us as classicists to Africa to learn the ways of African storytellers. And today, I think she really took us on this wonderful journey back in time and broadly around the world, I would say. So really many thanks to Ruth Finnegan for this wonderful occasion, for which I think we learned very much, all of us.